Ladies and gentlemen, now we will have a fireside chat on decent work in a circular economy, how to achieve a just transition. I would like to request the speakers to please take their seat on the dais. I would like to request Apurva Shankar, Senior Labor Market Consultant, Circle Economy, the Netherlands, Noreen Chaudhry, Head of Labor Rights Program, Lotus Foundation, and Sandra Gonza, Strategy and Business Impact Consultant, Tailwind, to please come up and take their seat on the dais.
All right, well, one of the last sessions. I know you're all very attentive. So I'm very excited about this chat with the both of you because we're talking about decent work, but I think throughout the day we've been talking about the circular economy and how transitioning to a circular economy brings so many values environmentally, resource use. But I think one thing we haven't really touched upon as much throughout the day is sort of the social side, the people involved within this economy or this new economy. So maybe to start us off, I have a question for you, Noreen, and that's really to say, when we are talking about a just transition, what are we talking about? And how does this relate to the concept of transitioning not only to a circular economy, but net positive economy? What do we mean? Yeah.
Thanks, Sandra, and thanks, Apurva. I love this all-female panel. I wish we could have more of these, but no. I think everything aside, and right before this session, I was having a discussion with someone. Why do we keep calling it just transition? It is a transition. Climate change in upon us. Inequality has manifested itself far more transparently than ever before. So I think the bigger question is the transition for who, and who decides what just looks like. And we were pondering on this, and I think the answer we landed on is that is going to be determined by the impacted communities. And I think from the loudest side, in terms of context, we are a philanthropic organization that works at the nexus between climate breakdown and inequality. And for us, just transition is about ensuring dignity. It's about bringing in a fair and equitable future that includes safeguarding against the impacts of climate and on the socioeconomic systems. And basically, in literal terms, it's about climate-proofing jobs and businesses.
Perfect, thank you. I mean, a very, very similar question to you, Apurva, but I think slightly different. You're with Circle Economy, and with you guys, you talk about the circular economy, two names, different things. But basically, how do you guys approach it at Circle Economy?
Thanks a lot, Sandra, and I think it's great to be here today. Thanks to all the conference organizers as well. And I think I totally echo what Noreen was saying, which is that we also ask ourselves this question often, right? Just transition is such a loaded word, and I think it automatically creates this sense of disconnect. It just feels like it's a foreign concept that's a bit hard to grasp. But I think really, it's about moving towards a sort of a system in which we look at social, environmental, as well as ecological unity and harmony. So we look at this triple bottom line approach. And from Circle Economy's perspective, so Circle Economy is an impact organization based in Amsterdam, and I think you've heard from some of our colleagues earlier today as well. So one of our colleagues said earlier today, Ola, that we are currently consuming about 100 billion tons of resources globally. And out of this, only 7.2% is recycled back into the system. So we are really operating, at a very critical stage where the current system where we're focusing on, the take, make, use, waste, linear economy is not going to be sustainable. So the circular economy is really about reimagining how can we work within the boundaries of our planet. How can we make sure that we have jobs that are equitable in the future? How can we redistribute wealth and power? Unfortunately, I think the circular economy agenda is often quite heavy on the environmental aspect and the economic aspect, but not enough on the social aspect. So I think this is something really critical for us to unpack further.
Thank you. And I guess I'm going to jump right back to you because I think right before this we were talking about the context. Who defines a just transition, but also where the conversation is coming from. There's a lot of EU policies that are happening in the global north. What's happening in the global south? And I think you had a perspective on this and where this is being determined.
Absolutely. So I think one of the things also to recognize is that circularity is not really a new concept. The term circular economy might be new, but circularity has been embedded in our culture for several decades. It's very much a part of our DNA. I think especially in the global south, we do come from economies where we have had to innovate. If I look at my personal experience and my grandmother's generation, if there was a piece of cloth, if there was a sari, a sari was never thrown away. It would be passed down across generations. It would be repaired if there was any kind of tear that is required. If the sari was no longer usable, it would be torn and used as cloth for cleaning. But this is a very simple example of circularity, but it is circularity. It is another form of circularity, and this has always been a part of of the kind of life we've always lived. So the first thing I'd like to say is I think circularity is very much embedded in the global south, in our DNA as well. And so that's the first thing. And I think also when we talk about circular economy frameworks and models, this is also based on our research. A lot of the focus is on the global north. And a lot of literature is focused around what are the studies and what are the trends that emerge from there. But actually, we need to really also shed light on what is existing currently. What practices can we lean on from Bangladesh, from the region, that are actually serving as guiding lights? And hopefully we can also talk about some of those in the course of this discussion.
Thank you so much. I mean, back to you, Noreen. And basically, I think you sort of mentioned it in your introduction of what a just transition is. But then I guess my question is, what do we mean, where do jobs come into play in this conversation? How are current workers impacted? What are the challenges they're facing? And what does this transition actually impact them?
Yeah, I think language in itself, the terminology that we've used is divisive. And I love what Apurva said, and we were having the same conversation. We might call it circular economy, but I think the old saris became blankets, and we've all grown up with this reality. So I think on this side, I think whether we call it green jobs, circular economy, it is all part and parcel of this transition that we have to make in this crisis that we find ourselves in. And I think in terms of jobs, be it a job in this new economy or emerging sector or a green industry, it all comes down to the basics. The basics is that we're protecting workers' rights, we're building worker agency. It's about being safe, being fairly paid, and something that enhances human dignity and addresses inequality through industry. I think industry is well poised because the private sector has the ability to unlock capital and innovation on what the jobs of tomorrow will be determined on how we define it today, and that always hinges on listening to those closest to the ground, and I think that's where the solution lies. And in terms of what the jobs of tomorrow might look like, I think this is where we need to start. And that's where philanthropic capital can play. We can take the chance, and we have a higher appetite for taking risks on what works for workers. And I think it's also speaking and meeting the workers or the impacted communities where they're at. I think about 3 years ago during the pandemic, we had the brilliant idea. It's like, okay, how can we position Bangladesh as a leader in the just transition journey? So we brought in innovators, actors, key advocates from the climate, gender, and labor movement. And we thought we were going to get a 10-point action plan. What we walked away with is, how do you expect us to come up with a joint plan when we're not even talking in the same language? And I think let's go back to the basics, meet the constituents where we're at, and together define what a good future might look like.
100%. I think, similarly, I think at Circular Economy, you published a new sort of report recently, and I'm hoping you'll give a bit more light into what that actually entails. But you guys talk about circular jobs specifically. And so how does that, relate to decent work, green jobs? How do you define it at Circular Economy?
So I really like what Noreen said also, which is about meeting communities where they are impacted, and I think speaking the same language, super important. So in terms of circular economy, we talk about how what we say in a nutshell is that in transitioning towards the future, what we want to do is place people at the heart. So this is really our message. We want to place people at the heart of this whole movement, right? But the truth is, we talk about how jobs are going to change. We say that, the estimates are that about 6 to 7 million jobs are going to be created as a result of the circular transition. But when you actually dig deeper into those numbers, you see that about 78 million jobs are going to be destroyed, and about 78 million are going to be created, and 72 million are going to be destroyed. That's going to mean huge shifts, right? That means that we need to make sure that workers are upskilled, have the right level of skills for these kind of job profiles that are going to change. And this was the reasoning or the driver behind behind undertaking our most recent study. So recently, which is about a month ago, the Circular Economy, ILO, and the World Bank came together to launch an initiative called Jobs in the Circular Economy. And the whole aim of the initiative is to measure, model, and monitor jobs in the circular economy, and really also to make that very tangible and practical. So we also want to understand, let's look at case studies, because we talk about these concepts and when we don't have cases that we can lean back on, it often seems difficult to relate to. So what we also want to do is to really highlight practical examples and case studies that can help us in understanding what these profile of jobs could look like. And we basically want to develop the knowledge base about decent work that policymakers and decision makers need to fulfill the promise of new jobs in the circular economy. Now, when it comes to our framework, so circular economy also has a framework of defining jobs. So we define jobs as core circular jobs, enabling circular jobs, and indirect circular jobs. When we talk about these, they are mostly defined from the dimension of how they contribute to, directly closing the loop. So they're considered as a core job. So jobs in prioritizing regenerative resources, for instance, are core jobs. Enabling jobs are jobs that are at the shell. So they are outside the core, and what they do is they support the uptake of circular jobs. And then we have indirect circular jobs, which are jobs in education and public sector, which, again, have a more indirect impact. When we talk about decent jobs, the picture is quite different, because the truth is that we still do not have global indicators that measure what decent jobs look like. And this is also part of the research and study that we want to do. We want to really also unearth, and come to a common language of what kind of indicators can we create globally, so that we can actually be able to measure not just the type of job, but also the quality of the job, and really be able to determine how decent jobs actually are. So I'll stop here and hand over to you, Sandra.
No, definitely. And I think there's a lot of synergies in a lot of what you do. And I think one thing that I was just thinking right now is just understanding, if we think about a transition in which decent jobs are not considered, are not contributing to this, what does that look like? What does that mean for workers if we're not looking at the transition that involves decent work for them? And I'm wondering if either one of you can sort of paint a picture of, like, what does it mean? Why is it important for us to be doing so now and considering it now as we're developing this transition?
Okay. So if I could summarize, what you're saying is, if we take the decent aspect or the qualitative aspects about a job as part of this transition pathway, it's not going to be, there isn't going to be a transition without having the fundamentals embedded in place. And I think that requires, like I said, building agency, jobs that offer dignity, there is safe working conditions, and most importantly, there is ability to speak up. And I think the problem with defining metrics is it's so contextual, but these are fundamental rights that are part of the realm of human rights. And I think otherwise we're just going to be transferring the problem every time we move to a different evolution of what a job can look like. I think an add-on into this aspect is investing in the skills that are going to be needed and fast accelerating. I had to learn from my 14-year-old son on how to use ChatGPT, and I still wasn't very good. But I think, and it's not just the stresses of climate breakdown that's going to shape the way what jobs look like. It's AI. I think the creator of artificial intelligence at Google, after creating all this, quit his job recently, saying that the accelerated space of AI is moving at a rate that is actually eerily scary. So and we need to equip ourselves, but there's also an opportunity. How can we use technology and AI to start transitioning towards these skills? I think Britspan recently did a study, and this is where policymaking and policy actors in the private sector can play a role, on 19 ASEAN countries on what are the top 5 sectors. It's for green jobs in the next 5 years. On the top 5 sectors were all related to part and parcel or pieces of the circularity model. It's included solar paneling, electronic vehicles, waste management, a built environment, and I can't remember the last one. But I think those conversations are having, but they're having in a piecemeal approach. The 3 things that we cannot compromise on the basic fundamentals of labor rights. That should be baked, and it should be a given, like we're in the 21st century. Secondly, uplift voices of impacted communities. Thirdly, embrace technology and use it to your advantage. And 5th, we need to be ahead of the curve and start forecasting what are the demand of the 72 billion jobs that Apurva said that looks like. What are the skills needed, and we need to invest in those now.
78, yeah. No, absolutely. I think also building on what Noreen said, I think, so, I'm going to refer back to some of the studies, some of the most recent report that we launched. So what we did there is we reviewed the existing base, and we looked at, 5 broad themes that summarize the key opportunities and challenges in promoting decent work. And as Noreen said, I resonate with that. I think there is no transition without prioritizing decent work. I mean, without that, we will not have, we will not have workers' well-being at the center of it. And if we don't bring along our people, then we cannot go anywhere, right? This is all about people at the end of it. So the first thing that we looked at, the first theme was labor market and sectorial transformation. Now, what we interestingly see is that in the literature, there's a lot of study that talks about what kind of jobs, how many jobs are going to be created, just as I'd mentioned earlier, some of the statistics. But what we find is that there are very few studies that focus on the quantity as well as the quality of jobs. What we also find is that, as I mentioned earlier, most of the research is focused in the global north. Where it is focused in the global south, most of the studies are focused on the waste management sector, which really shows that there is so much of, we really need to tap into how this is going to look like in sectors beyond waste management as well, right? Because this is only a small portion of what we're talking about. Another thing we found is informality and the circular economy was another theme that we investigated. And we really see that the informal sector is so key to this whole journey because they represent about 60% of our global workforce. In Bangladesh, the informal sector, according to the 2010 labor force survey, represents 87% of the workforce. So that's a huge part. I mean, when we are talking about so many of these initiatives, we're essentially referring to 13%. What about the remaining, huge part of the economy that's not part of the formal economy? And what we see is that, the informal economy is really also underrepresented in these studies. And there's also really scope to deepen that work. In terms of work reallocation and skill development, what we see is that we really need, we need workers to transition from linear to circular jobs, and this is really dependent on development of deep skills. So, it's really important that we tap into different networks here. Private sector players, vocational institutions, government, we need everyone to come together, and really this needs to be a two-way process of input into the labor market and policy. In terms of working conditions and social protection, what we really see is, again, this is not really represented enough in literature, and we really need to develop measures to improve the working conditions, especially of the informal sector. right? Where we do see some research, this is mostly on occupational safety and health and waste management and recycling. However, other aspects of decent work like remuneration, inclusion, collective bargaining are mostly left unexplored. Finally, what we also looked at is gender discrimination and social equity. So what we see is that projections again say that in a circular transition, we will have more jobs for women, for female workers. However, if we do not manage the circular transition, the same blind spots that we have in the linear economy are essentially going to be propagated. So it is not enough that that the research is promising, but it's also really important that we manage this transition well by involving all the different stakeholders and players that are involved. So again, I will pause here and pass over.
No, thank you so much. I think one of the things that you mentioned, and I think, Noreen, we had a conversation about this, I think you had mentioned social dialogue as one of an essential element in designing some of these jobs, including these voices. I'm kind of curious what challenges you've sort of experienced when setting this up, when trying to see what these decent jobs could be, and if there are any solutions or approaches that you are using.
I was actually thinking of asking a question to you and Apurva, and thinking in my head is, just transition is not a new concept. It's actually came out of the labor movement. Its roots are embedded in social dialogue. I think one of the key things we've seen in kind of starting those conversations is the example I used earlier. Lack of evidence and accountability. We're all... Terminology is divisive. We are defining things different ways. And I think the most important thing is creating those spaces for sustained dialogue. This is not something where we're going to have KPIs in 5 years. It's a long-term process. And I don't think the industry and the community always is willing to invest in that long-term marathon-like mentality that's required, because we're bringing in diverse actors who are not natural allies to create a joint roadmap. I think the idea is to have a common understanding, but in order to have a common understanding, it hinges on looking at the problem the same way and also agreeing on the terminology. I think building the awareness, socializing the concept, and most importantly, keep meeting the individuals where they're at. And I'll give you a specific example. We're trying to understand how can we bring actors, such as workers, as part of the climate movement, because in their head they're like, look, we just want to get paid, we want decent jobs, we want to get on with our lives. But if you tweak the kind of narrative, and Bangladesh itself is the 7th most climate vulnerable country, we're supporting a study with Cornell University which is going to show exactly how heat and rising temperature and rising water level is going to impact major production sites. And the numbers are quite scary. But however, to get the attention of worker-led organizations and entrepreneurs, it's like you have to break it down in numeric terms. Due to rising heat of 1 degree within your factory, you lose your productivity by X amount, which means you lose your salary by X amount. And Mr. Factory Owner, this is what it means to you. I think it's really important to not just talk in abstract concepts, the point Apurva made. Everyone knows the problems, and sometimes after a while you're like, okay, the ship has sailed, what can we do? What can the solutions look like, and what's needed to scale them? And contextualize them. And I think with regards to the study that Circle Economy's done a while back, about 4 years ago, we also tried to do a similar one with BSR on bringing in the gender aspects and the dynamics that we need to be mindful as this new sphere of jobs are emerging, which begs another question. So it's great to see that the issue of informality of work is something that's front and center, and the impacted communities are the ones who don't necessarily have the agency. So that's important. But my question to the both of you is, where do circular jobs end and green jobs begin? Or are they part of the same gamut of things? Or is it something that we're missing? Or are we overcomplicating the process?
So I think that's a really tricky question, and I don't really have the answer for it. Where do circular jobs begin? But I think the thing is, circular does not translate to good, right? So jobs that are good for the environment are not jobs that are good for workers necessarily. And I think that's a really, key point to make. So the circular economy is also not socially just by default. We need to design it and co-implement it in a manner, in an integrated manner to achieve need satisfaction, well-being within planetary boundaries. And of course, social dialogue is very much a central part of that. And in fact, coming back to the point of informality, if we actually implement circular activities without deep interrogation, it can actually lead to further marginalization of workers, right? So, there's an example from Tunisia that we see. So in Tunisia, the national government formalized the recovery and recycling of post-consumer packaging waste. And they created something called EcoLef, which is a state-run system operated by the National Waste Management Agency called ANGED, right? Now, although it is spoken about as a successful case, and it is in some aspects, what the strategy failed to acknowledge is that there were so many informal workers who were involved in the waste collection process, called barbichas. And these, about 8,000 barbichas, were not actually able to access the EcoLif collection spots directly. So they could only, trade waste through an intermediary, which means that they made huge losses, and they were also not part of the formal protection system. So such a strategy, though, might seem circular at first glance, has actually led to further marginalization of informal workers rather than inclusion in formal entrepreneurship. And so, these kind of strategies are the ones that we need to be mindful about. So when we really talk about embedding circularity, we need to think about also what could potentially be the detrimental impacts and, have a more holistic perspective.
And I guess just to add to that, I think a personal opinion would be, we're talking about new jobs. For me, it really is, we're talking about new jobs and what do future jobs look like. I think for a matter of accountability, I think for the longest time, circular economy or circularity has been the hot cake of policy of who's going to be accountable for it, who's responsible for it, what ministry, where does it fall into? And I think it becoming circular jobs, I think allows it to sort of categorize it in a certain way. But I honestly think it's a matter of semantics, and it's a circular job. It's a green job, it's a decent job. I think in a way those definitions are very intertwined. And I think that's how I would view it. I think it's kind of looking beyond that, and when you get to defining that, how do you contextualize it for your supply chain or to your community? And I think that's how I'd answer it. I think another question that I did have, I think there's a lot of projects, there's a lot of circular economy projects happening in Bangladesh right now. And one of the questions would be, they all have different focuses and different ways of implementing it, but not always looking at decent jobs or sort of a just transition as an element of that project. What would be your, whether it's advice or how can they address this aspect as part of what they're doing? Because essentially, they want to transition towards circular economy. They're building different infrastructures for it, be it recycling, be it a policy approach. How can they include a just sort of decent work as part of what they're doing?
I can go first. I think Apurva, you and I already touched upon it. Talk to the people. Talk to your workers, find out what does it look like, because there is going to be a knee-jerk reaction that what do these circular jobs mean? Does it mean that we're going to be out of jobs? There's going to be a natural resistance. What do just conditions look like? I mean, it all comes down to the basics, right? Decent wages, agency, and I think some of the work that our partners at GIZ are doing, creating the enabling ground for insurance, social insurance is a key important role here. As we've seen during the pandemic crisis, those who are the most vulnerable were plunged into further precarity due to the lack of social safety nets. And I think as part of this transition, be it to circular jobs, green jobs, whatever we want to call it, I think having those safety nets that buffer the shocks while this transition is taking place is absolutely essential. And I think the other thing is this is actually an exciting time. We are, for once, seeing a race to the top with the EU Green Deal, the circularity directive in the EU, France is making its own mandate, the US has introduced the Inflation Reduction Act, which is going to create the demand for these newer jobs and newer transitions. Events such as this positions Bangladesh to actually be a leader in this space, start investing in the conversations, the spaces, and the skills. I think skills are really, really important, and this is where the private sector has an incremental role to play, and the international community can bring in that technical know-how, and then we unlock the opportunities for scalability, leveraging the research and the evidence that's been created by organizations such as Circle Economy.
Yeah, I think that was that captured it very well. I think it's really about social safety nets, absolutely about upskilling, understanding what we need to prepare for, making sure we have conversations, and just to touch upon this as well. So we've spoken earlier today, but a project that we're working on right now is called Switch to Circular Value Chains, and this is a project that we're running with UNIDO, Chatham House, and EIB, as well as Circle Economy. It's an EU-funded project. And, right now we're in a phase where we're really trying to understand what kind of capacities do we need. So as part of this project, we're working in Bangladesh with the textile industry, and we're focusing on post-industrial textile waste. And as you know, a part of our trip to Bangladesh this time has also been to meet with different suppliers and understand, what kind of training gaps exist. How can we design something that is complementary to initiatives that are already there? Because there's already so much work that is going on. And as part of this, what we also did is we visited a cluster of SMEs that are in the northern part of Bangladesh. And this was such an eye-opening experience for us. So this is a cluster that focuses on using post-industrial textile waste, and they basically recycle it completely, and they use that to make products that are 100% recycled, such as shawls, blankets, household products. And it was so inspiring because what they do is they get the waste from Dhaka. This is mostly sweater waste. They unspin it. They convert it into bobbins, and then they send it back to Dhaka for recycling. If it is not possible to be recycled, they use that to make ropes. And this here existing was a community of really micro enterprises, mostly family-led businesses, working with, hand looms and power looms that are such an inspiring example of circularity that already exist. And so these are the kind of solutions that we also need to look at, because these are not high-tech solutions. These are low-tech solutions, and these are cases that we can really look at for inspiration. So as part of our work, what we're also really trying to do is shine the light more on these kind of examples, and also see how we can support them, because what they need is probably not principles of circularity. They don't need to be taught what circularity is, because that's their bread and butter. But they probably need a different kind of support. So this is also just a general call to action that we're, if anyone sees potential to collaborate on this project as well, we are here and welcome to exploring discussions as well.
Thank you so much. I think we're almost at time, and I think maybe a final question or a final note. We'll be back a year from now. Between now and next year, what are the things that we can start working on? We can start doing, and the conversations we can start having, who do we start having those conversations with? And how can we prepare?
Well, half the room has left, so. But no, I think events such as this is laying the foundation for the conversations that we can have. But I think it's not just about, it's creating the spaces for conversation and also listening. I think that sometimes we get kind of embroiled in the urgency to deliver. I think taking the time to listen and designing things that celebrate the locally led adaptation or innovation is a space that we hope we're going to be building. I think it's what Apurva started with. circularity is not new to our part of the world. We've had to learn how to do with a lot less, and we've been innovators in that space. And I think we can recapture that positioning, provided we keep an open mind. And I think in a year from now, I hope that we won't be having separate conversations on green jobs, circular jobs, linear jobs. And it's all part and parcel of surviving with dignity and climate-proofing jobs and businesses. So we'll have one event, a big mega event, that kind of brings in the actors and celebrate the solution providers that Apurva mentioned.
Yeah, so I think just to add to that as well, I think we're all part of the dialogue, right? So who do we speak to? We speak to all of us. It's policymakers, it's business owners, it's academia, it's all of us, right? And I think a year from now, hopefully what discussions we can be having is about showcasing some more examples of how we've really managed to successfully, push the boundary in terms of not framing circular economy as a concept that is rooted only in the ecological identity, but also really making it about the social agenda. And hopefully a year from now, we'll have many more inspiring cases from Bangladesh as well as the region to showcase, for that. So yeah.
Thank you very much.